Hey students, so this week in sociology we are going to continue to look at social groups, that micro scale side of social structure. We're transitioning into chapter 5 and we're just going to focus on a few pages of chapter 5. It's like the first 6-8 pages of the print copy of the textbook, but if you are looking at the digital copy, you want to look from the beginning of chapter 5 until right after the section where they discuss a vocabulary word and a concept called groupthink, because that's where we're going to stop in chapter 5 before we transition into portions of chapter 6 and then round out our midterm and have a midterm test that covers everything from chapter 1 until those sections of chapter 6 that we cover in additional lectures this week. Okay, so make sure that you're talking about chapter 5 and those few pages through the section that discusses groupthink, and then listen carefully in those videos that I cover about chapter 6, what sections you need to look at from there. Okay, so we're going to cover a lot in this video, so I need you to pause a second and look back over your notes from previous weeks, especially those where we started talking about social groups and also that micro scale aspect of life. So was it the looking glass self, or was it role playing and significant others, or was it the dramaturgical analysis of human experience? Any of those last few things that we talked about last week, we're going to kind of round out the discussion today in this lecture with those ideas, but then maybe try to come full circle and wrap our brains right back around to the macro scale forces that guide all those micro scale things that sociologists have observed that we do in our daily lives. Okay, so we need to talk about group dynamics. Dynamics is a word that just refers to the way something functions. How is it going to work? So you can talk about the dynamics of chemical reactions. What happens in a chemical reaction? You can talk about the dynamics of baking and how how does yeast cause leavening to happen? That's a dynamic action. How do things happen? How does it work? How do groups function? And so, primary groups and secondary groups tend to have different motivating factors, different dynamics that make up the behavior that you have of members of primary groups and members of secondary groups. So we're going to look at group dynamics, but we're going to look at it in the lens of, are we talking about a primary group because there's different characteristics of a primary group, or are we talking about a secondary group because there's different characteristics of a secondary group? And so therefore, do we manage our impression? Do we have impression management that I've written down here, tiny on the board down here? Do we manage our impressions differently based on the kind of bond that we have with people, based on the leadership style? Like, is there a leader that emerges if it's not like a formal organization where you have a supervisor or you have a teacher and I have a department chair? If it's not a formal organization with a hierarchical structure where you know who the leaders are, do leaders emerge anyway? And are they, how do they take over those leadership roles? That kind of thing is what we're going to look at. And this video in particular, since I've just been talking about supervisors and a chain of command in business, this kind of knowledge in sociology, and you can take it in interpersonal communication also, these are really good skills and knowledge to have if you yourself intend to be a business owner, a boss, a supervisor, or whatever, because knowing the different types of dynamics that occur when you get people together. Do those people know each other well? Is it large numbers? Is it small numbers? Can communication happen among everybody equally because it's small enough to do that and nobody feels neglected? Or is it too large for everybody to have contact with everybody else, and therefore some people don't communicate their ideas with others? So it's very good for you to know leadership styles, communication patterns. I have odd number of people in a group is best. Find out why here in just a second, but please pay particular attention to these dynamics, group dynamic information, because if you want to be a leader, if you want to be a supervisor, you're going to really rise above and be noticed compared to other people if you're able to, gauge other people's reactions and measure what's in your script. I don't think I have the word script. Yes, I do. What's in the script, right? So there has to be an author for the script, so it can kind of be you if you know the group dynamics. Okay, so primary groups and secondary groups, if you don't remember the difference in those characteristics, stop right now and look at week 5 or whatever week that was, 6 or something, I don't know. But look at your notes where we have those different characteristics. And remember that primary groups tend to be small, and we have 2 particular types of small group sizes that we have names for in sociology. One of them is a dyad, and another one is a triad. A dyad is 2 people, and a triad is 3 people. And these are unique size groups because they have intimate communication patterns, not necessarily meaning you're talking about deep, dark secrets, but because you're able to converse with each other on a regular basis and nobody gets neglected necessarily. So 2 people talking, it's easy to communicate between the 2. 3 people talking, it's easy to communicate between the 2. When you get to 4, 5, 6, 7, you've got more and more likelihood to where some people within that group wouldn't be paired for conversation or get points across to each other. So that's an important thing to know. Also, the odd number thing, the dyad, 2 people, if there is a disagreement between those 2 people and they can't come to a compromise, then a dyad, or actually any even numbered group, 4, 6, 8, any even numbered group has the potential of a stalemate where they can't come to a conclusion, or a breakup where you can't stay with that person anymore, whether it's romantically, whether it's your best friend, whether it's whatever. If there is a conflict that you're not willing to bend and I'm not willing to bend, then a dyad can be among the most volatile or fragile group sizes, because there's nobody to break a tie. If you think you're right and I think I'm right, there's nobody who can necessarily say, okay, stop this. This person is more right than the next person, and come together. And that can be a very volatile or a very fragile situation. On the flip side, also, dyads can be extremely strong bonds to where you have a vested interest in being loyal and sincere with each other. And therefore, you can sometimes form extremely stable bonds moving forward. But that even number and that lack of a tiebreaker role that someone else brings in can also mean that if a dyad breaks up, it's broken up for good, often. So a triad is a third person added to that group, and that third person usually can be that tiebreaker. And if there are emotional bonds with these people, then they tend, even if I get angry at you because you sided with her instead of me or something, usually that falls to the wayside after a while, because the next time there's a disagreement, you and I are the ones who are bonding, and that other person is, the odd man out at that time, as far as the direction that the decision is going to go. In formal organizations, though, which are secondary groups that are characterized by strict rules and processes, applications, and qualifications and duties that are supposed to be performed, in those kinds of organizations, that it's just one particular type of secondary group, these small-size groups, if you have a work that needs to be done, a project that has deadlines, and you have to make decisions and allocate resources and purchase things, typically these small-sized groups are not a good idea in the business world because of the volatility that can happen. Because in a secondary group, when you have instrumental bonds, I don't have a vested interest to keep the group together because I'm not emotionally tied to you. If I have a really different idea about what vendor we need to go with because I have these people are better on human rights than those people and you're disregarding that or something, we don't necessarily have a bond that's going to keep us together, and it could cause you, the supervisor, to be dealing with us more often, being that tiebreaker if it's just the 2 of us. We'll go to you and waste your time because you didn't embed the tiebreaker in or ask us to, set forth the processes that we agree to follow before we start our project. Odd numbers are always best for group communication patterns. 5 tends to be the magic number in a business setting when we have instrumental ties with each other. 5 tends to be the ideal size because it's small enough for all those group members to have one-on-one communication with each other. It's small enough to do that without people feeling neglected or feeling maybe like they should keep quiet if they have different ideas. So 5 tends to be the size that gives you the tiebreaker role because it's an odd number, but also doesn't make the script kind of oppressive. So if there's a person who tends to be shy, or if there is a person who for whatever reason feels as though they lack power in a situation, still 5 people tends to make that person more comfortable over time and tends to allow the leader, whoever emerges as a leader or who was intentionally designated as a leader, it can make the leader notice, Susie over here is really quiet all the time. Susie, what's on your mind? Like, it's small enough for me to notice that she's quiet all the time so I can approach her in the way the leader thinks would be the best way to get her to open up about what her thoughts and feelings were on these things. So, so leadership, that brings us to leadership. So leadership there's lots of different types of leadership. You can use these words expressive, instrumental versus expressive. Expressive ties means you have an emotional bond. So there's also expressive leadership and instrumental leadership. There's authoritarian leadership. So there's all kinds of different leadership styles. And some of us might naturally, look at my air quotes here, oh, I hate that I'm saying this, but some of us might tend toward leadership roles. However, if we are the leader who tends toward that role, we need to really be careful and monitor the communication styles. We need to study those interpersonal communication cues that come in the form of nonverbal communication, body language that can tell us are people comfortable or uncomfortable with the way we deliver messages. There are lots of different leadership styles, but typically the best way to approach it, excuse me, I think I'm going to sneeze. Oh, okay, hopefully not. But typically the way to approach good leadership is to combine expressive leadership and instrumental leadership into one, because some people are going to respond better to instrumental instructions, like take out the garbage. Hey, it's your turn, take out the garbage. That might be, somebody might appreciate that direct style. On the other hand, an emotional leader makes friends a little bit, appeals, oh, did you find your cat? He was gone yesterday when you came home from work, and I almost texted you to find out whether he came home or not. They remember those little personal things, so there is a rapport to build from, and the other person has a vested interest in participating with the leader's guidance. So typically, that's the best way to do that. And all the while, in group dynamics, whether we know it or not, we are monitoring and identifying what the script is, and we are engaged in impression management. So that brings us to this topic of groupthink that I told you is where we're going to end in chapter 5 for the sections that you are responsible for this week's reaction paper quiz and also the midterm test. Groupthink is this it's kind of scary to me, but it is this idea that especially if the group is too large, remember we said that 5 people tends to be the ideal size because it's an odd number, so you have a tiebreaker, and it's also small enough for us to notice and care about whether each other is having input or not. But if a group gets too large, a group that's necessary to make certain important decisions so that we can move forward, say like a coronavirus task force or something. If those task forces have too many people on them, and therefore, because you don't have a leadership role, or because maybe you do have a little bit more introverted kind of style to your communication process, perhaps you feel as though you shouldn't speak up. And groupthink is a phenomenon that seems to occur especially if a not so talkative or outgoing person has a different idea than what seems to be the popular idea that most people in the group are discussing and agreeing with. Often, groupthink is this phenomenon where the script somehow calls for you to keep your idea quiet and not present that alternate point of view. Because this popular view seems to be like the going thing that everybody else is hitching their wagon to. However, there are many cases throughout history, and recent history I'm going to call all the way back to the 1950s. So we have like the Bay of Pigs invasion, and sorry for the little glitch in the video there, but we were talking about groupthink situations. The Bay of Pigs is an example in history. You can look at the space shuttle explosion from the 1980s as an example. In retrospect, they can look back to see that some of the engineers dealing with the space shuttle launch that had the first teacher in orbit, Krista McAuliffe was her name. Anyway, it was such a huge hype in public. It was such excitement that the first teacher who was nominated from the students, and I think she was like a third grade or fifth grade teacher, something like that, and she went through the selection process and trained to be an astronaut, and like everybody followed her on TV. It was like one of the reality shows that you grew up with in your lifetime, but that was a new thing, for when I was little. And so anyway, it was such a big hype and everybody was waiting for this. And unfortunately, when it launched, it blew up a few seconds later and killed everyone on board. And after that horrible event occurred, come to find out, some of the engineers who were working on the project said, I didn't feel comfortable about this, and there was this thing that we needed to tweak, and I knew that this had, happened when we were simulating trials, that this had happened a certain percentage of the time, and I didn't feel comfortable. Well, thanks for telling us now. You could have changed the entire outcome. You would have been extremely unpopular. You would have been a big bummer for a whole bunch of people who were looking for this event to take place successfully. But because you kept quiet, you could have saved, 7 lives. I think there were 7 people, including that teacher, on that space shuttle that exploded. And then further, more recent history, this happened when you were little, the Exxon Valdez explosion, the oil rig in the Gulf that exploded and killed, I don't know how many dozens of people, but there was a movie made about it. I think Mark Wahlberg was one of the stars in that movie, I think. But anyway, after the fact and all these lives were lost, oh yeah, come to find out, well, it was a very unpopular thing to speak up because it would have cost the company millions of dollars in delays or equipment or something if these certain things that certain people noticed had been fixed. But how can you measure a human life, for instance? And so there are some extremely disastrous results of groupthink throughout history that you can look up. There's some examples in chapter 5 when you're reading about this section. But but let's look at this for just a second. That's why I said at the beginning of the video that we were going to come from this micro scale group dynamics behavior thing all the way macro scale. Because if you look at what the script is, like where does the script come from, especially in the workplace, we are taught, we are pushed and pushed and pushed to think that our position within the economic structure or the workplace, our occupation, is such a central component to our social identity. So on the macro scale, we have norms for success. And those norms for success usually include the idea of some measured wealth. And I say wealth, it could be middle class is the goal that you have for your wealth in life. Most people, when they are asked about the American dream, which we will investigate a lot starting in chapter 6, but definitely in chapter 7, most people, when investigating this idea about the American dream, if you ask them what does it mean, there are various answers that people will give. However, financial security usually has something to do with the answer people give. So some people, especially women, because remember, master status of women is usually labeled as caregiver, but many times women will say, I just want a happy, healthy family. But even if that word, those words that they just strung together, doesn't have the word money in it, let me ask you this. Are families and happy, healthy children cheap? Those suckers ain't cheap. They cost money, especially if they're going to be happy and especially if they're going to be healthy. right? So all of these macro scale forces and assumptions about life and how it's tied to your job, could those macro scale forces be part of the motivation of groupthink? You want to not be the popular one at the office, the one who costs the company more money because you speak up about something? That could potentially damage your position with the company or your security moving forward, or maybe your chance for a raise or something. At least, do you think it's possible that in our impression management processes, where we are kind of going over the script, what should I do here? Do you think that possibly that macro scale force, that macro scale norm, that social fact, that patterned way of thinking, feeling, and acting, where our life identity is so wrapped into the job that we hold because we need that income, we want that promotion potential? Do you think that perhaps that macro scale force could be part of the motivation of some of this groupthink stuff? Certainly, there are macro scale forces that guide our everyday lives because there is never a disconnect between macro and micro. It is always a constant loop. So consider that when you're studying groupthink, and also consider that when we are looking at motivations for people to behave in what we call deviant ways in society, because chapter 6 that we're transitioning to in our next video is all about deviant behavior. So there are norms in society. Norms are the expected ways for you to behave, but it's also rules about what not to do. So we've got some rules in life that we are supposed to learn how to follow in our socialization process, but perhaps there are people around us who aren't following those norms. Perhaps there are people around us who teach that opposition to authority, or, sticking it to the norms of society, is a positive way to bring about social change, or to avoid the same old social script as has always been around. So in chapter 6, we will look at deviant behavior, and we're going to tie it all into this. So don't compartmentalize any of this. Don't just say this comes from chapter 5 and I only need to know about it from chapter 5. We got to build all of this stuff. We're coming up to midterm, but we got to carry everything from midterm all the way to finals and then into your successful lives after that. So text me with questions. Bye.